Welcome to the South Asia Democratic Forum podcast. I'm your host, Taposh Kanti Bol. Today, we begin by taking a brief look at two major conflicts that are reshaping the regional and global landscape: the escalating Pakistan-Afghanistan war and the US-Israel war against Iran. First, on February 26, 27, 2026, Afghanistan's Taliban government launched attack on Pakistani military bases, reportedly in retaliation for earlier Pakistani strikes. Pakistan then responded within hours by bombing Kabul, Kandahar, and Paktia, with its defense minister declaring that the two countries are now in open war. The situation escalated rapidly. Pakistan's strikes marked its first major attacks on Afghan urban areas, shattering a fragile ceasefire that had been in place since October 2025 and triggering heavy cross border fighting. Meanwhile, on February 28, 2026, the Middle East was rocked by an even more consequential development. The United States and Israel jointly launched large-scale military strikes on Iran, initiating what is now known as the 2026 Iran conflict. These opening attacks killed Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and targeted missile infrastructure, air defenses, and leadership sites across the country. The US-Israel operation, codenamed Epic Fury, was followed within hours by Iran firing missiles and drones at targets in Israel and US bases across the Gulf, transforming the confrontation into a regional war. Both conflicts are already producing ripple effects across South Asia. Not only South Asian countries share borders with Iran, a major share of its workforce is working in the Middle East. And one of the most immediate tension is global oil prices jumped sharply, with Brent crude rising more than 40% above pre-war levels. In Bangladesh, analysts warn that even a $10 per barrel increase could raise the national energy import bill by nearly $900 million, placing renewed pressure on foreign exchange reserves and inflation. These wars are reshaping trade routes, energy security, geopolitical alignments, and the humanitarian landscape, all of which directly affect South Asian countries. To unpack these developments and their implications for minorities, vulnerable communities, humanitarian norms, and diplomacy in South Asia, we are joined today by Indira Boutier, returning to the podcast with her deep expertise in regional political and security dynamics. Welcome, Indira.
Thank you.
Could you define how the Pakistan-Afghanistan conflict and the Iran-US-Israel confrontation are reshaping the broader security landscape of South Asia?
Although these crises appear quite geographically distinct, they are producing a form of what we can call a strategic compression for South Asia. So on one side, we have the Pakistan-Afghanistan conflict, which obviously destabilizes the region's western frontier. And on the other side, we have an escalating confrontation between Iran, the United States, and Israel, which is at the moment disrupting the entire wider Middle Eastern security environment, on which South Asian economies depend, as you said, earlier. So today, together, these crises create a situation where security instability on land converges with economic vulnerability at sea, placing South Asian governments under simultaneous military, economic, and political pressure. So in terms of number, for people also to kind of grasp the impact, there is at the moment over 15 million South Asian workers, which are estimated to live and work in the Gulf Cooperation Council, so the GCC countries, with over around 8.5 million Indian migrants alone living in the region as of 2026. By the region, I mean Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and Kuwait. And so migration of Indian workers to the Gulf increased after the oil boom of the 1970s. And the scale of migration to the Gulf is so high that Asian, Western, and non-Gulf Arab migrants collectively comprise the majority share of the Gulf population. So it's almost 70% of the total workforce. So now, let's have a look at what is happening with the Pakistan-Afghanistan conflict. So what we are witnessing at the moment is a collapse of Pakistan's long-standing model of a proxy-based frontier management. So for decades, what happened was that Islamabad attempted to shape developments in Afghanistan in an indirect way. So through influence over militant groups and political factions. And this strategy allowed Pakistan to avoid direct interstate confrontation while still maintaining, leverage across the border. But the escalation of 2026 suggests that this model is actually no longer sustainable because for decades the relationship between Islamabad and Kabul was shaped by Pakistan's doctrine of what we can call a strategic debt. So this approach relied on, as I said, indirect influence and the management of non-state actors rather than open, military confrontation. But as I said, this model now has collapsed. So since the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan in August 2021, Pakistan has experienced a sharp increase in militant attacks, particularly from what is known the TTP, so the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. So Pakistan authorities have repeatedly accused the Afghan Taliban of allowing these groups, to operate from Afghan territory, creating what Islamabad describes as a sanctuary problem. And these tensions, all of this situation escalated in early 2026, so a couple of weeks ago, when Pakistan launched a series of airstrikes against militant targets inside Afghanistan, including areas such as Nangarhar and Partika. So the operations later expanded beyond border to include strikes on locations associated with Taliban governance and military command. And so, as you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, the Pakistani government's declaration of an open war marks a decisive shift in the regional, security environment. And at the end of February 2026, Pakistani's defense minister Raja Asif made a striking declaration, and he says now it is open war between us, Pakistan, and you, Afghanistan. So for the first time since the Taliban's return to power in 2021, Pakistan has directly targeted major administrative centers such as Kabul and Kandahar, signaling a break with decades of managed instability along the Afghanistan and Pakistan frontier. But the implication of this escalation extends far beyond the immediate battlefield. For three reasons. First, the Afghanistan-Pakistan frontier is evolving into a zone of what we can call a conventionalized conflict, rather than merely an area of insurgent violence. And so this raises the possibility of a prolonged war of attrition between the two sides. Secondly, the conflict intersects with other regional insurgencies, including Baloch separatist movements, which could destabilize Pakistan's western provinces. And finally, the confrontation has an impact, a humanitarian pressure. So fighting along the border has contributed, without any surprise, to displacement within Pakistan's tribal district and has worsened instability in Afghanistan, where, already nearly half of the population already depends on humanitarian assistance. But I think what is more dangerous and what is important to note is that this escalation creates a dangerous precedent. Because if cross-border strikes becomes normalized as a counterterrorism tool, then the Afghanistan and Pakistan frontier risks evolving into a permanent, low-intensity interstate conflict rather than just a zone of episodic insurgent violence. So that was Pakistan and Afghanistan. And as you mentioned, currently there's also a conflict in the Middle East, so with Iran, the United States, and Israel. So at the same time, this conflict is creating a second layer of strategic disruption that directly affects South Asia. So for South Asian state, the Iran crisis is not just a simply distant Middle Eastern conflict. It represents a systemic external shock, because the region's economic model remains deeply intertwined with Gulf economies. So large-scale strikes targeting Iranian military and nuclear infrastructures have escalated into a wider regional crisis, with Iranian retaliatory missile and drone attacks across the Gulf. So for South Asian countries, the implications is important because of the deep economic, demographic, and energy connection with the Gulf region, as you mentioned at the beginning. So the Gulf region functions as a triple economic anchor for South Asia. It supplies energy, it employs millions of migrant workers, and it also holds the maritime corridor through which much of the region trade flows. And so as a result, instability in the Gulf rapidly reverberates across South Asian economies and society. But the conflict really crossed a critical threshold on 28 February 2026, when the US and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iranian military and nuclear facilities. And as you said, these strikes reportedly killed several senior Iranian leaders, and it triggered a rapid escalations. So Iran responded with waves of missiles and drones, not only towards Israel, but also towards US-aligned states in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. And so within just a few days, the death toll had already risen to more than 1,100 people in Iran, with additional, casualty reported across neighboring countries and in Israel. But the consequences do not stop at the military level, as you can imagine. They also directly affect millions of South Asian migrant workers in the Gulf. And as I said earlier, around 17 million workers from South Asia live and work in the region, many of them in construction, logistics, and service industry. So early reports indicate that workers from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal have already been injured, unfortunately, or even killed following strikes in the Gulf countries. But the situation is made even more complicated by the closure of large parts of the region's airspace. It's not just about migrant workers who are unable to return home. Even though countries such as Pakistan have already begun activating, emergency evacuation plans, what makes these workers particularly vulnerable is the nature of their employment. Many low-income migrants depend on employer-controlled contracts and often do not have direct access to their passports or the financial resources, needed to leave quickly. So that means that geopolitical confrontation between major powers in the Middle East quickly becomes a humanitarian issue for South Asia, whose economies rely heavily on migrant labor and the remittance they send back home. But one of the most immediate consequences relates to energy supply and maritime trade routes. So what happened is that Iran's action around the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical energy transit corridors, have disrupted global oil flows and contributing to rising energy prices. So some numbers. There is approximately 20.9 million barrels per day normally that transits through the strait. So it represents around 20% of total global consumption. So we went from 60 vessels per day to just 5 confirmed transits on 1st March 2026 following Iranian threats and attacks. So the Strait of Hormuz is actually considered the most critical energy choke point in the global economy. And following, these numbers, you can understand the proportion of it. So any disruption, they reverberates immediately across international energy market. So for South Asian economies that rely heavily on important energy such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, this creates a direct transmission mechanism through which Middle Eastern conflict rapidly becomes domestic economic instability. And so increased energy prices can rapidly translate into inflation, fiscal pressure, and debt instability. But there's also something else that's important to take into account looking at those two conflicts, is that the escalation in the Gulf has also triggered protest and political mobilization in several South Asian countries, which may have a risk of sectarian tensions and increased domestic polarization. So, for instance, there were some protests in Karachi, Lahore, and Islamabad in Pakistan, as well as some in Lucknow and Srinagar in India against the strikes in Iran. So, for Pakistan,
Also
the
in
government in Bangladesh as well. So, in Pakistan, the government is facing internal pressure from religious parties to condemn the US attacks. And it has complicated its relationship with partners, with Western partners, and more importantly with the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. So the central challenges for policymakers will be to be able to maintain a strategic autonomy while also managing these overlapping crises without being drawn too deeply into wider great power confrontation. But as you can imagine, there are also, humanitarian impact on border communities and minority regions. So what is important with that is that the human consequences of these conflicts are particularly visible, as you can imagine, in border regions and peripheral provinces, where populations already living with structural marginalization are now experiencing intensified vulnerability. So if we look at the Pakistan and Afghanistan conflict, there has been the emergence of large displacement zones along the frontier. So for instance, in Pakistan, there's the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, particularly in the Tira Valley. And if there's a fear of major military offenses against the TTP, so the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, and it has triggered the displacement of more than 70,000 civilians, the majority of whom are women and children. So many of these families have been forced to flee, but the issue is that humanitarian infrastructure in these areas remains limited, and it leaves displaced population with inadequate access to shelter, healthcare, and food assistance. And as you can imagine, two groups are mostly impacted with all that: children and women. So for children, the impact is very clear: malnutrition, disease, and also a prolonged interruptions to education. For women, access to healthcare becomes particularly difficult due to the shortages of female medical staff. So repeated cycles of displacement deepen the crisis. Some families have already experienced multiple waves of displacement since early military operation in Pakistan's tribal areas during the late 2000s. And so these repeated movements erode livelihoods, they weaken local markets, and gradually they dismantle social support network. But across the border in Afghanistan, the humanitarian situation is actually even more severe, because nearly half of Afghanistan's population is projected to require humanitarian assistance in 2026. So imagine combination of cross-border conflict and the return of large number of refugees from Pakistan is placing immense pressure on already a social system that is fragile. Again, and with no surprise, children are particularly affected. Millions face severe food insecurity and acute malnutrition, while humanitarian organizations warn that displacement increase the risk of exploitation, so human trafficking, disease, and also long-term psychological trauma. Again, women and girls face additional vulnerability in the Afghanistan complex because Taliban restrictions on female employment and education also affect the humanitarian sector itself, limiting the ability of female aid workers to operate freely. And so this creates a gendered gap in humanitarian access, meaning that essential services such as reproductive healthcare or even nutritional program for pregnant and breastfeeding women, they often fail to reach those most in need. So I mentioned the return, or actually I should say the expulsion of Afghan refugees from Pakistan, and this has intensified since late 2025. So although deportations occur, many removals are not carrying out through direct force expulsion, but instead Pakistan has increasingly relied on what legal scholars describe as constructive refoulement. So constructive refoulement occurs when a state creates such a hostile legal and administrative environment that refugees feel compelled to leave, even without formal deportation orders. Constructive refoulement occurs when a state creates such a hostile legal and administrative environment that refugees feel compelled to leave, even without formal deportation orders.
Mhm.
So, several mechanisms illustrate this process. Since October 2025, Pakistan has one tightened visa requirements, a residency checks for Afghan nationals. So that means that on the ground, authorities have also closed 16 refugee camps in Khyber, Pakhtunkhwa, and Balochistan, displacing approximately 90,000 refugees who had lived in Pakistan for decades. And at the same time, the expulsion policy has expanded to include individuals who previously held recognized legal status, including the ACC and the POR. So ACC stands for Afghan Citizen Card. POR stands for Proof of Registration Cards, and that is issued with the UNHCR Corporation. So this shift effectively actually weakens the tripartite protection framework that previously governed refugee protection between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and an international organization, so the UNHCR. An also important point to mention is the arrest and administrative pressure. So human rights organizations have also reported widespread arrest and harassment since April 2025. So since nearly a year, more than 144,000 Afghans have reportedly been detained, including individuals with valid registration document. Again, as I said previously, among those affected are children born in Pakistan, many of whom have little or no social connection to Afghanistan. So these measures raises serious concerns under international human rights standards related to family life, social integration, and arbitrary detention. But there's one last element that I think is important to mention, is the gender dimension. And it comes up to the concept of gender apartheid. So I've already mentioned a couple of times how women are impacted differently. And so the humanitarian crisis also has a distinct gender dimension that is very important to take into account. Since the Taliban arrived and returned to power in 2021, women's participation in public life has been progressively restricted. And these restrictions intensified further in 2026 with the introduction of a new law called the Law on the Propagation of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. Among other provisions that I'm not going to go into detail, the law requires 4 important elements. The first one is that women's voice should not be heard in public spaces.
Okay.
The second one is that women must be accompanied by a male guardian. The third one is that access to secondary and higher education remains prohibited. And the last one is that employment opportunities for women remain extremely restricted. There is at the moment, and I think it's important to say it, a growing international debate about formally recognizing gender appetite as a distinct international crime because it reflects systematic and institutionalized gender persecution rather than just isolated acts of discrimination. And this is an issue that's currently under discussion in negotiations concerning a future and possible treaty on crimes against humanity. But there's a couple of elements also to mention. It's the ripple effects on vulnerable communities within South Asia. And I kind of already mentioned it a couple of minutes ago, is the sectarian tensions and political mobilization, the internal security pressure, refugee movements, and economic instability. And I think it's important to focus on sectarian polarization and also internal security pressure.
Regarding ripple effects, I just like to add one thing. Like what I'm seeing,
Yes.
what is happening in Bangladesh is that the present government in Bangladesh and also the right-wing political parties, after this war started, they have started communication and networking with terrorist outfits within Bangladesh. And it has been seen that the law minister, the prime minister himself, is talking with the leaders of these terrorist outlets like Hizbut Tahrir and others. So this is one of the ripple effects which we
Yes.
could pay a huge price, because if these outlets decide that they will take part in the war and support Iran, and then that means that they can spread all over the globe, including South Asian region. Another sad part of this ripple effect is the silence of these right-wing political parties about the violation of law of war and humanitarian laws in Afghanistan Pakistan war, and especially even in the Iran and USA war. We have seen that Bangladesh especially is very cautious while expressing uh, their cautionary words towards USA or even Israel or even towards Iran, which I think is a failure of their diplomatic uh, ties as well. So in this situation, you also suggest that how South Asia should build a diplomatic framework that balances this competing pressure, and they can address these violations strongly while not
Mm.
destroying their diplomatic ties with these countries. Do you have?
Yeah. Yeah, and as you said, South Asian governments face a very delicate diplomatic and legal challenge because, on the one hand, there's credible allegations of violation of international humanitarian law. So, international humanitarian law, to make it very simple for those who are listening to us, when you enter a conflict, when you are at war, you cannot do whatever you want. You have to respect laws. And these laws is what we call international humanitarian law. So that includes attacks on civilians, hospitals, or schools. And this cannot simply be ignored. But on the other hand, taking strong political positions risks drawing regional government into the broader, geopolitical rivalries between major powers involved in these conflicts. So there's a couple elements that, could help South Asian government. The first one is principled neutrality. The second one is multilateral engagement, and then consistent legal standards. So if we look at the principle of neutrality, rather than allying themselves politically with one side or another, governments can anchor their responses in the fundamental principle of the United Nations Charter and international humanitarian law. So this means condemning violations consistently, regardless of which actor is responsible. So, attacks on civilians, the bombing of schools or hospitals, and the targeting of civilian infrastructure, as I said before, violates core international humanitarian principle wherever they occur. So, by focusing on these universally accepted rules rather than just geopolitical narratives, which is, in a way very easy, states can defend international law without appearing to take sides in great power rivalries. So in an area where there's a lot of accusations of, what we call in law double standards, increasingly undermining the legitimacy of international law, consistent application of humanitarian norms becomes a strategic interest for middle powers, not just a moral commitment. But this approach is very important in conflicts such as the Pakistan-Afghanistan's escalation, where the classification actually of the conflict itself raises legal questions under international humanitarian law. So once hostilities reach the threshold of an international armed conflict under Common Article 2 of the Geneva Convention, the conduct of hostilities becomes subject to very strict rules, including the principle of distinctions and proportionality. So, if we look at the case of the recent 2026 escalation, so the Pakistan's Operation Hazab-Lil-Ak, which reportedly targeted 22 locations across Afghanistan, including sites in Kabul, Kandahar, Nangarhar, Paktika, it illustrates how quickly cross-border counterterrorism operations can reach that legal threshold. So according to reportings by the UNAMA, so the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, strikes in Nangarhar province alone reportedly killed 13 civilians, including children, while damage was also recorded in mosques in Paktikak, located near suspected militant facilities. So it's important that these legal principle allows government to focus on civilian protection rather than political alignment. And so the second point that is important is the need to operate through multilateral institutions rather than just unilateral political statements. So South Asian governments can support international humanitarian law by working through frameworks such as the United Nations, the non-aligned movements, or even regional or multilateral diplomatic platforms. So through these channels, actually, states can call for independent investigation, humanitarian access as well, and accountability mechanism without directly confronting powerful states involved in the conflict. And also, what is important and actually quite good with the multilateral engagement is that it provides political cover. So, when positions are articulated collectively, they reduce the perception that individual countries are aligning themselves with a particular geopolitical bloc. And so, this strategy reflects very long-standing diplomatic tradition in the region, where many states have historically sought to maintain a form of strategic autonomy within an increasingly polarized international system. And the last point is the growing perception of double standards in the application of international law. So in many parts of the global south, there's an increasing skepticism about the selective enforcement of a humanitarian norm, and actually not just humanitarian norm, international law in itself. So when violations are condemned in some conflicts but ignored in others, the credibility of international law, as we can imagine, gets weakened. So South Asian governments have an interest in emphasizing that humanitarian law must not be instrumentalized for geopolitical purpose, and the same legal standards should apply to all actors regardless of their strategic alliances or political influence. Again, and one last point, beyond diplomatic statements, governments can also contribute particularly and practically by supporting humanitarian access and protection mechanism, which is very important, especially in the context of Pakistan and Afghanistan. But this in practice may include supporting UN humanitarian operations. It can also be through facilitating aid delivery to affected population and advocating for ceasefire or humanitarian corridors. But I think ultimately the goal for South Asian states is to defend the integrity of international humanitarian law without becoming part of a great power competition. So this requires a careful diplomatic balance, condemning violations, supporting accountability mechanism, and most importantly, promoting civilian protection while grounding these positions in consistent legal principles rather than geopolitical alliances. And so, in this sense, the credibility of international humanitarian law depends not only on global power, but also on the willingness of regional actors to defend its norm in a principled and even-handed manner.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of today's episode. The escalating conflicts between Pakistan and Afghanistan and the US Israel confrontation with Iran continue to reshape the global landscape, from regional security to humanitarian fallout to energy markets, with significant repercussions for South Asia's political stability and economic resilience. To help us understand these developments and their impact on the region, you have been listening to Dr. Indira Boutier, lecturer in law at Glasgow Caledonian University and lead legal advisor at the IX Global Justice Human Rights Law Clinic, bringing deep legal and comparative expertise to today's discussion. We are grateful for her insights and analysis, which shed light on the complex ways these conflicts reverberate across South Asia. Thank you for listening to the South Asia Democratic Forum podcast. I'm Taposh Kantibol. Join us again as we continue exploring the challenges and possibilities shaping the region's democratic future. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and take care.